Hello? Hello. Thank you so much. That was incredibly rich series of talks. Really, so much to dig into and extrapolate. Um, so there's a few common threads. There's also some questions I had about. There's a kind of a movement. None of you feel like you're taking a particular side in the material that you're presenting. There's a sort of presentation of dualism in terms of the potential for the self to be somehow kind of co-opted into this immaterial labor system, but also this potential for experience of, of self-realization in a sense. I was wondering if you feel like that there is a kind of a way to circumnavigate what I think is, to an extent, a kind of like elephant in the room here, which is like the large-scale media industry behemoths that are kind of driving the contemporary state of this industry. Most of us are using AI, and the majority of us are using ChatGPT, OpenAI, Google, and beyond training local models. Do you feel like there's a way to kind of navigate that tension between the sort of extractive force of those entities and the emancipatory potential of us as individuals using them?
No. I guess what we're interested in is kind of taking the landscape for where it is in terms of who is controlling and developing this technology, and moving like a step away perhaps from the responsibility of reconciling that, and instead into the ways in which it can be used to potentially develop or enhance in some way our humanity. So it sort of feels a little bit like a cop-out, but I think we probably deliberately, it's sort of the elephant in the room that we deliberately don't address because it feels kind of impossible or like outside the scope of what we're thinking about. But instead, we're sort of trying to imagine, okay, in a world where this is happening and these kind of behemoths are creating these systems and tools, is there a way we can correct for that, for the dehumanizing aspect of it, by finding ways in which it can help us return to a different way of living in our actual bodies?
I think there's two complexities here in this question, at least I can think about. The first one would be the idea that Arthur C. Clarke says that any sufficiently complex technology feels like magic, something like that. That if we don't understand how technologies work, we are caught in this feeling of the idea of the black box, right? How does this work? How are AI generations happening? So first, we need to be empowered by knowledge of understanding how those AI generations work and how they impact our society and how they are based on the index of photography and on the reality itself. The second thing I would like to bring up is this idea that we've been talking about, how we do not like to talk in things in terms of this binarism between the representation and the fabulation, as opposed as the real and the lines. So how can we see things as not as opposed, but as a spectrum, and how they all are related and intertwined at all times? Do you want to?
I'll take a side. This is bad. We're screwed. Like this is, but more, nuanced. That I think something that, for example, the Flusser work might not address properly is the speed at which this stuff is coming at us, and how we might not have this time to decode all of it. That we're just images are hitting our retina and they're being decoded there without us knowing. Maybe I don't know if we'll be able to develop that skill in time to make sense out of all of this. And so it's great to see some of these potential uses of it, but I think that happens when you go beyond the image. It's that question of like, what is it that you're actually trying to, other than just I created something, here it is, I wrote something, here it is. And we're kind of losing some of that, I think, in our even email that we just get, because someone decided to send an email. What are they saying? So I think this framing, again, the image of the photography, like what were we trying to capture when we hit that button? What is something I think of when I use these things. Then do I need this? Do I not? So anyways, this is...
It has more to do with public pacts. Pacts? Used to this word? Yes. Like, I think we are going to redo this. I think the culture is always in movement, so it always depends on the public pacts.
I think for me, all of this makes me rethink photography itself and this idea of the index and the idea of reality and truth. Who's been holding the camera all along? Who's been kind of directing the gaze on behalf of society and humanity? So it really sheds light for me on the past and previous mediums and gives me a better understanding of even how powerful language is, right? And how it too can shape our sense of what's real, what isn't real, what's important, what isn't.
Sorry, one quick thing I wanted to add off the back of here that occurred to me is the idea that to think of the kind of corporate behemoths and the way in which they present us with something like AI feels often passive as the way in which you interact with it, right? The way you use something like ChatGPT or Alexa or whatever these things that are integrated into life are designed to kind of pull you down this particular path, ultimately towards, I guess, spending more money or spending more time on their platform or whatever. And it has a kind of reinforcing effect to tell you what you want to hear in order to keep you there. And I think what's interesting about a way to try and balance that or find other ways through it is to think, this is why I was interested in what you were saying, to think of something very deliberate and mindful to do with it. So what do we actually want to use it for, and what do we really want to achieve is, I think, a way to kind of work against the idea that we're just passively like sucked into the kind of AI generation of endless slot.
Yeah, I love that. Is this working? Yes. Yeah, so Natasha, I think you touched on this a little bit, and you both used the word promptography, which I think is really interesting. We're in a university, and a lot of us are professors, teachers. If you think about the kind of beginning of photography and its placing inside the field of art making specifically, or contemporary culture, it kind of had an uneasy relationship with painting, with other media, until it was sort of it created its own space and its own history and critique around itself. Do you think it's useful to be thinking of these kinds of images within the lineage of photography in the long term, or should we be talking about this as a completely different medium with its own sets of concerns and values?
I was going to say both. I think both are useful because it's so complex and because it draws on so many, we're not reinventing everything. It draws on a lot of the things that have already been established. So I think it's useful to parse through those histories and those ideas, and then to kind of navigate and be open to where they're different, like what new circumstances are brought about by these different technologies.
I think that it depends on what you consider photography, because yes, I think it's totally on photography when we are talking about this stuff. Flusser would say that technical images, like they are all technical images, so they have the program beyond. The camera is the first prototype of computer. It's like program. And so I think if you think in this line of trying to see visual culture and the technology of image as a whole process, it's all about photography. But our modern culture only rests photography in the pact of indexability in iconographic stuff, that it's okay. It's a way to play with it. So yes, both. We have to think on both ways.
They would just please go on.
Are you sure? Yeah. Just a comment on the tension between like photography and painting and what we have now, and maybe photography is. I don't think Canon, Nikon, JVC had the kind of like political, social power that these companies have, and so it gets a bit complicated there to see. I don't know, to use this equivalence in some ways, because I always like to think, if we had some of the future technologies from the past that we were told we would have, like invisibility cloak and teleportation, like Facebook book would be the one controlling that. Would I want to use that? It's almost like I don't. So the forces behind it really muddy this. And as artists, are we contributing to like look how sexy this is? And, we're like the marketing team for this opaque system,
Yeah, and I also think, building off of that, I was interested in the tension between, Natasha, what you said about going from copying to producing, and also the apparatus as a toy that stimulates thought. I think the camera is definitely a toy that stimulates thought in a certain way, but the number of kind of choices that we're delegating, I think, on these platforms, it's a different apparatus. The limitations to play are a lot more intense and opaque, I think, than with a reproductive technology like the camera. And again, yeah, I agree with everything Thiago said about the kind of financial force behind all of these companies, and the political, social force that they're, bearing down on us with as they publish these and advertise them and push them to us, make them harder and harder to avoid.
Say that besides the social and political thing that we're discussing here, looking at the side of the technique, at least in my perception, photography kind of detached from painting when it started showing its own potential, right? So it gave us the possibility of doing photojournalism, for example, photographing a war. I'm just doing basic, very examples here. Because within a blink of an eye, you can catch something happening right away. So this is just one example of the potential of photography that is sometimes very specific to photography and not for painting. And what I always say is probably AI-generated image will reach this level of finding the potential that is very specific to that medium. It won't detach completely from photography and the photography discussion and the visual culture, but it will probably find something that it does quite really well.
I just want to jump in really quickly and add, I think part of what's important about photographic history is to note the limitations there as well that were driven by companies like Kodak and its now well-known kind of racist history as well. So I think those questions of sort of the problems that come with the territory and how these companies deploy decisions are also like well established, and so we can learn from that.
Great, thank you. So one more question. I have to be honest that I have not actually, I hadn't read a lot of Flusser before we started going through the applications and seeing the through line in all of your work referencing Flusser and thinking through his ideas. So I went down the rabbit hole, and he talks a lot in his time about a shift in the way that politicians and the public, protesters, the kind of social sphere discourse space was becoming performance to camera, and that the camera and I suppose media in general was providing this kind of, under the pretense of an objective reflection to what was going on so as to inform the community, the population. Do you see a kind of disruption in that kind of public sphere by the complete kind of potential for arbitrary photorealistic images that undermines this kind of truism or this truth? Or have you already refuted that in your presentation?
I think what it makes me think of, I just wrote this down, it was cut from time from our presentation, but was just thinking about it before, the Fred Richten book, After Photography, where he says that it's about Photoshop in this context, and he says something like, with the advent of Photoshop, photography goes from this happened to this could have happened. And so we already, through that experience, learn to kind of like mediate our own sense, have our own literacy as to what an image might represent or not, what may or may not have happened. And this then, to go back further to, if you think of like the Cottingley fairies, the fake falsified images from 1917, I think, of these fairies that people thought were real, we've been learning ever since then not to trust what's presented through photography. And then these additions of different layers of technology just kind of take that further. So now, to extend the idea from it's not that it happened to it could have happened, now it doesn't even need to be possible that it happened. It can be like, Margaret Thatcher is like doing a press conference on the moon and it looks totally photorealistic. It doesn't even need to fit into the realm of possibility that it could ever have happened. So these things shift, but I think we actually are very capable of adjusting to them really successfully. They just feel scary and confronting in the moment, but actually as things go on, we sort of start to re-educate ourselves about how we understand these images.
Yeah, I also, building on that, I'm curious about Thiago's point about how is all this stuff happening too quickly for us to kind of spiritually or viscerally understand it. I think that intellectually it makes sense, but I still find myself tricked or, not being able to discern. And I have almost this kind of like back part of my brain that wants to believe in images as representations of reality. But yeah, I think that when we were speaking about assembling our presentation, we were really interested in the speculative potential. But thinking about like real-time images now, can you trust them? I have both hope and like reservation about our...
And I have to call myself in quickly based on what you've just said, which is that it is also important to remember actually that parts of our brain do not understand. This is why kind of what we were talking about is relevant sometimes. Parts of our brain cannot understand even if we intellectually know something is fake. It still affects these parts of our brain. This is why these types of things like treatment of body image disturbance can be successful. Also treatments for people recovering from something like a stroke. There's all these kinds of different things that we haven't included using like deepfakes or synthetic media. Because the part of your body that sees your left side moving normally, even though you can't anymore, it doesn't know the difference. Even though you intellectually know that you're watching synthetic media, that part of your brain doesn't and can retrain it to move successfully again. So I suppose we have to be mindful that even though intellectually we become increasingly aware that images can be totally fabricated from nothing, that it could still impact how we see the world or how we think of the world, because there's part of our brain that we can't shut off from being affected by it.
And the fact that we can produce any kind of image, but also publish it in some way. So like the point in which we maybe had, was it sort of gatekeeping, now it's more democratic, but also has sort of diffused this power, so it's like we are not even sure where to push back and why. So it's, there are fake images of people being attacked by bears, and then there's fake images of real things that will have, day-to-day consequences that I think are being processed by the same parts of the brain and kind of muddled in some ways, and not knowing where to push back, I think, is a big part of the... If it was just the, news organizations creating fake stuff, it'd be like, that's kind of easy. We can point and go. But there's another layer that might not have been predicted by some of these, which, normal. But...
Yeah, I think that we also need to reconsider the language that we are using to refer to those things. The idea of true or false, once again, bringing this up again. Because photography is also a narrative, is also a construction. And if I decide to point the camera there instead of pointing here, I'm also building a narrative around the fact that it's happening here. So is AI. So photography is also this creation that is not totally depicting the reality of what's happening, but it can also be true. Photography is where also use it, the technical camera and the lens were also used to create works of fiction. And it doesn't mean that they weren't true and that they weren't actually happening. So maybe it is about the concepts that we are using to describe stuff.
I come back to the public pacts. I think that we have put the on photography the journalism pact. I think that the documentary pact. So we hope culturally that it tells us some true, and that's it. But also the ambience that it circulates. So if it's an artistic photography, we are just what is trying to communicate. I don't know. We don't put it in the words of true or not true, but we only try to understand something. But in media, I don't know, in social media, we are just trying to understand the public space with a lot of image that we don't know the public pacts they circulate. So what is it? I don't know. We are just building. They are not settled on the new public pacts AI image. So the Instagram told us to tell this is AI generated image. So it tried to pack something that it may be not true. But if it were a photography, would it be true? What's truth? No.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and observe something that seems like it's not related, but I feel like there's this other kind of reversal happening whereby the fantasy is becoming corporeal. There's like a plastic surgery craze going on, especially among really young people to look, I don't even know if more youthful is the right way to phrase it, but so that's happening as well. So it's this interesting internalization of this reality, this thing that's being shaped by so much manipulation, in part because of these tools.
Gia Tolentino calls it Instagram face, I think, which is like the developing trend to look a certain way, which is like outside of really how anybody would normally look, and is this like strange amalgam of certain like cat eye features and like a certain kind of indistinguishable like skin tone that you know like a certain type of hair and like face shape and whatever that people then start to try to recreate in their physical selves using things like surgery or fillers or different kinds of like physical adjustments that they can make in order to replicate what's been fed to them digitally that doesn't actually exist except through digital manipulation.
It remembers me Donna Haraway, the cyborg manifest, like where the body ends now, when in the skin or in the image, what's the limit of the body?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Great. So thank you very much. On that note, let's hand over to the audience. I think we have time for a small number of questions. Does anybody have... Yes. I'll give you my microphone.
Hi. Thank you for the panel. I wonder, I'm going to try to get this into a question. We talk about the elephant in the room and what are the effects on us and how we see these images. And I wonder if the panelists can talk about a little bit to disaggregate who we is. Because, and what's behind that question is that I think that really matters. I'm very, very struck by the number of artists, specifically marginalized artists from marginalized communities who get hold of these tools that could otherwise be very dangerous, and they make a beeline for liberation. They make a beeline for it. And I'm interested in that process, and I'm interested in how people are thinking about that.
For those artists, that's the whole point, right? They've been excluded from visibility for so long that once they get access to this tool and they recognize they have a certain position of privilege to have access to those kind of softwares because they're costly. You do need a good machine that can perform those generations in real time for them. And they know that this place of privilege, but they also understand the place of discrimination they've been living throughout their whole life. So it's this kind of conflict that leads those marginalized groups to consider, and this is a question that I've been dealing myself for a long time, how can we give birth to a new AI? How can we consider that technology has been dominated by an hegemonic group for so long that we don't even understand what is AI and what is technology without that thing inputted from the very start. So I guess they're just trying to conflict and play around with this idea and also bring the light that we don't have to accept AI as it is. We can conflict, we can subvert, we can rethink it to bring new narratives.
They are not in datasets, database. They are not there. So it's not democratic, like we used to use this word, like is democratization of technology. Yes, they have popularized it, but I think that democratize this technology is another stuff, and there are lots of people doing that now, trying to do that now. So they have no options but create.
It reminds me, and a lot of what you talked about in your presentation reminds me of a very rich history of artists. I'm thinking personally specifically of queer artists who make things like historical recreations of works. So restagings of like Renaissance paintings, for example, or moments from history or historical figures, which allow them to retell parts of history from which through traditional kind of canon they've been excluded. And so it feels like a natural continuation of that kind of tradition of remaking, of the opportunity to reimagine a situation in which they could never have been depicted in that way or included in that kind of piece of the canon.
Hi. This question's very fragmented because this is a very generative discussion and so much to unpack and so much resonated very deeply. And so I wanted to ask specifically, this is a question for Isabella and Micaelle, but other folks, please feel free to chime in. I was wondering, like, when you spoke about the violence of archives and using like generative tools to like undo systems of harm, either through like to like counter like forces of like omission and erasure, through things like fabulation, like I guess like thinking of like Sadia Hartman and just like other folks, like what are like some of the limitation and how like viable is that? Because I feel like there's like so many ethical conundrums to like grapple with that, like in terms of like speculative like world building, because I think Natasha also like mentioned like the baked and like biases like with like Kodak, like things like Shirley cards, and how that also like seeps into data sets with things like image nets and like all kinds of like baked in by like, so how feasible is it? And like in order to achieve that, like what would that mean? Like would it mean like building data sets like in community, like from the ground up, like a more decentralized way, like outside of existing tools? Like I'm just like wondering if you could like talk about pathways.
So technically speaking, there's a few ways you can go around, and I would say that one of the artists, I guess Gisele and Mayara that we showed here, they worked on creating their own data set, photographing. So it's a true labor, very manual to photograph each plant species, go through archival pictures of enslaved black lesbian women, how they were depicted. They didn't exist. Those representations that she created didn't exist back there. So which images she can go through on those archives that are in fact recorded in order to feed them into the machine in a process that we call, I completely forget. But is creating this specific data set that you are doing but creating her own collection of images, feeding to the machine, kind of going through this process of teaching the machine how to perceive those images. And Mayara talks a lot about her process and how she uses lots of words in a very detailed description on the cultural, the facial expressions, the kind of attire they will be wearing, what does the scenario look like. So being very meticulously detailed and also feeding her own imagery, because that's the truth. They were not from the early on included in the data set of those models. So it's a very manual labor of inclusion.
Now, Laura.
I worry is that there's a broader name for that not very senior right now.
I don't know what's going to be when the maximum quantity of images in databases would be formed by AI images. Because today, what we have is that they are photographic images, or they are photography like classic conventional photographies, or they are like painting that would be digitalized, photographed in a way, and they're there sculptures. I don't know. We have synthetic images and photographic images inside the data set. It's only what's possible to be digitalized there. So now we are increasing the quantity of synthetic images created by AI, but it depends on the prompt, I think. I think we have to think the culture of the prompt. So we are doing research to put diversity at minimum. I don't know.
I'll just say a very quick thing. I think we're at this point where we're no longer convinced. I think across the board, we've been told that big data is like the best data, right? The bigger, the better. And more we're realizing that's not the case. And so I think there are opportunities for small data sets and to really learn from those types of collections, which feel like you have a better sense of what's involved in them, obviously, but they feel maybe truer to a particular project or something like this. So I think all of this has to do with a big learning curve as well, as we become more and more familiar and understand how these things work or certain parts of how they work. These become opportunities for us to maybe perform an intervention of sorts.
Just wanted to say that the technique name actually is fine-tuning. So that's a broader area. Yeah, it's fine-tuning.
Great. Thank you so much. I feel like many of these topics are going to bleed into the next session, Truth and Trust, which starts at 3:30. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. It's been an incredible conversation.